Let's get close, but not so close. QuaranTIME. You can share from a distance. QuaranTIME. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your QuaranTIME space while we talk.
Hello, Peter Hirschberg here, and welcome to the 9th episode of QuaranTIME. As you know, we started this about 3 weeks ago, kind of early on, when we realized that we would all be in this exceptional, almost sacred moment of being at home, detached, and then figuring out how do we live our lives, and what does this crisis mean about what's next in society in terms of science and innovation, and whether there'll be enough ventilators. Just under the surface was an incredible unanimity of purpose and innovation going on, and that's kind of what we've been covering so far. Today's show is going to focus on ritual, spirituality, and grief. This was signaled as something we knew a couple of weeks ago. We'd be heading into a week in which there'd be beginning to be a peak amount of losing people, of deaths. Maybe, I think in the US already there's been around 150,000 deaths. That's an extraordinary event. How do we cope with it? And what we're going to find today is that actually in the middle of reinventing rituals, both because of grief, but also because we're at home and using now all these technology systems, that area also leads to innovation. We're going to hear from Rabbi Irwin Kula, who's going to give us a sense for the landscape of this and how this actually pushes innovation even in the world of religion and what we can learn from it. When it comes to innovation, we're going to have Tim Chang. He's one of the top VCs in Silicon Valley. He's at the Mayfield Fund, but he's been concerned with issues of mindfulness and technologies that kind of enhance our presence. And he has just been in the middle of a lot of this. And also out of this crisis comes a thesis about what comes next. Silicon Valley's developing a thesis about how things will be different. We're going to hear from that. And then we're going to hear from Jen Sander, whose research has been around ritual and play for years. And as the leader of global innovation at Burning Man, is able to both look at one giant ritual and at society at large. So that makes this I'm very excited about the show. Let me bring on our co-host, Mickey McManus.
Hey, Peter.
Welcome back. Well, Mickey, you were not here last week because you had an extraordinary experience in this domain. Yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to you. An experience that several of us have had on this show is we've all been at a number of funerals lately. And in your case, you have gone through this process with your dad.
Yeah. Peter and I talked a little bit and we said, we're going to have to do one on grief. And I said, okay, I'm not happy about it in some ways because I'm in the middle of it. So I'm kind of a mess. But yeah, we lost my dad last Sunday, and he actually died with complications from COVID in Chicago. And it was all a distributed experience. Omid, if you can pull up the first picture. I thought I would just share what I saw happening in this process. This is a 1959 Corvair. Leave it on this until I finish with my Corvair story. So my dad was a consummate maker, and he taught me, he was a car mechanic, he taught me how to work on cars, take them apart, put them back together again. Usually I ended up taking things apart, not figuring out how to get them back together again. This was a 1959 Corvair, the very first year. My dream was that it would never be driven, really. It would just be a cool design conference room, because it was actually the most dangerous car in America. They were trying to out Volkswagen, the Volkswagen Beetle. And Ralph Nader, this fellow that you might know now, having run for president a few years back, wrote a book. It was actually the first entry into his sort of visibility, called Unsafe at Any Speed. Because these Corvairs, if you were going 15 miles an hour and took a turn, it was a rear engine car, it could pogo stick the back axle and lop off your arm. And in fact, GM was dealing with an awful lot of lawsuits. And it led to the rise of this thing called the aftermarket, where you buy special things for the car, because effectively the car was sporty, and it was a man's sporty car, which just meant it could kill you, and you had to do things. So I bought this, and I had it in the backyard, in the storage area behind our garage, and I was going to restore it and do things with it, beautiful. And my dad came to me and he said, I was probably 17 at the time. He said, Mickey, you're never going to use this car, are you? You're never going to finish it. You're never going to do that. You've got like 3 other things. You're working on a Volkswagen. What are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. I mean, I think I got it because it was just this icon of design, and I'm in design and everything. And he said, can I take it to my students? He taught shop class at this point in his life to public school students who are like the dregs of society. You always get thrown into the shop class if you can't do something else back then. And my dad thought, that's just crazy. People who work with their hands are amazing. And so he said, can I take the car and can I see if I can do something fun with it with my students, teach them something neat, and we'll work on it. And I said, sure, take the car. That's fine. And he said, I'm probably going to teach them how to use cutting torches. We'll see if we can kind of like mod it and stuff like that. And I was like, whatever, do whatever you want, Dad. He took the car, and a few months later near Christmas, I said, hey, Dad, whatever happened to my car? And he said, well, we took the engine out. It was a rear engine 6-cylinder. We mounted it on a table, and we turned it into a rig so we could test starting and stopping the car, and they could learn how to tear down an engine and put it back together. And then we decided to build like an off-road go-kart that we would compete at states with, because the kids get really excited if they can compete. It's kind of like football. And then he said, oh yeah, by the way, I wanted them to learn how to use cutting torches. And I thought it'd be really fun if I had them use your car to learn about it. And so he pulled out a box with some Christmas tree ornaments, and he handed me a Christmas tree ornament. He said, I had them all make your car into Christmas tree ornaments. It was the same color as my car. Because I thought that'd be fun if they got a chance to like cut the hell out of your, the teacher's son's car and turn it into Christmas ornaments for all their family, for their moms and dads. And I start with that story because that's what we found happening at the funerals, where each person, each of the siblings, his wife, the other kids and family members just told these wonderful, crazy stories about this guy, Mike Russ McManus, my dad, and how he just loved lighting people up with learning and making and doing things. Omid, can you bring up the next slide? The other thing I did was I sent a note off to some friends, and he had been in the Air Force in Korea. This is a picture of him in the Air Force in Korea. And I sent a note off to a friend, and I said, hey, he's not going to get an actual send-off from the Air Force because of the COVID lockdown. Could you take a picture of yourself just saluting him? And I want to, hand it and sort of give it to my dad's wife because she had been at the 100th anniversary. And instead of him sending that picture, he actually sent a note to all the people in the 13th Bomber Squadron in the Air Force, and Tim, another friend who's running down at Mojave, all the test pilots. And here's Ghost. He flies these things called B-2 bombers, and they all saluted, and they sent pictures, and I sent them to my sister, and she like actually put them on a loop by his coffin at the funeral home. And of course we had to zoom into the funeral home, but it was this thing that I just wanted something, and we were all just crying our eyes out. And Carol just sort of froze when she came in. Her husband Russ had passed away, and she was worried that he wouldn't be honored. And that was the kind of thing I started seeing. And so we thought today would be a good day to talk about grief. That happened last Thursday and Friday. We had the burial service and zoomed in on that, and everyone was really creative and clever about both creating kind of new rituals and some other things. Omid, can you pull up the last picture? And then the last thing I want to point out is, like, this is my dad. So this really encapsulates him. He's a child, and he's a troublemaker, and he's a maker. And I think this idea that one of the rituals that we had was make stuff. And in fact, some of the grandchildren actually got some of the kits that my dad hadn't finished when he passed away, and actually took them home and made them. And we're sharing them on a message, on a message that we all had as a group message of things they were making because he couldn't make them anymore. And I think, I do think, Peter and I have had a real passion around making as this almost gateway drug that helps you kind of get out of yourself and try to, especially when you make something for somebody else. It kind of it's an amateur all the way to virtuoso mode. So Peter knew somebody, Rabbi Irwin, and said, you really should talk to him. And I just met him the other day. We reached out to him, and Irwin, can we get you on? Let's see, Omid, can you bring Irwin in? Irwin, I had just such a wonderful experience talking to you. I think about my own personal stuff, and we thought, okay, he is the perfect person to kind of help us understand what people are going through.
Well, I mean, you did some, Mickey, first of all, you honored your father just now, like, and I never know, like, what's ritual, what's real life. I think we're in this remarkable moment of, it's like a founding moment again. And all these rituals, all the rituals for grieving, all rituals in general, they start because they're actually, a real human being is connected to a real live event. And because we are human beings, we make things of it. We make practices, we make symbols, we make, and look what you, and that's what you did. And I think, you know, part of what's going on now is because we can't outsource stuff the same way. We can't outsource our grief to a rabbi or a minister or a priest. We can't outsource it to a community, to a built-in community that's going to be there no matter what, because they have to. Even a nice have to. We can't outsource any of it. And when you can't outsource your psycho-spiritual life, you have to make something of it. And the remarkable thing is, it's sort of the external event gives you, it forces permission for you to make of that which you inherit. And that's what, it's like literally what you did. I can show you every wisdom tradition says, here's what a eulogy is supposed to be. It is supposed to do two things. A eulogy, we all learn this in, like, you know, minister school. The first thing eulogy is supposed to do is to comfort the mourner. The next thing the ritual is supposed to do is put the first story together of the person who's being remembered. And of course, that's what you did, right? The people who showed up, the people who are saluting, those are sort of on the ground, immediate rituals. Okay, so maybe at another time you could fold a flag and you can get everybody together and the formal thing would happen. Here, people had to take agency. And of course, that's the most remarkable thing.
Well, I will say that we talked about sort of someday we have to actually get physically together again. We're hoping we can. And I'm responsible for that because I think my sister was the hero in this whole thing. My sister and my little brother, who are there in Chicago and kind of working on this. And I said, look, I'll take the memorial. It's probably going to be a year from now. I don't know, hopefully. But we're going to have a good Irish wake. We're going to drink. We're going to trash talk my dad along with kind of memories. And we're going to do sort of what I remember growing up in ritual, which was Irish Catholic ritual. Yeah, and because Carol is Jewish, we ended up having kind of a hybrid approach to sitting Shiva over the weekend with Carol and other things. And I ended up having so much respect for just sort of all these ways, this sort of approach that we have developed over civilization to cope with things. And everyone is different and different, you know, we all have different approaches, and I can't subscribe to one or the other, but
no, I think one of the things that's happening.
One of the hallmarks of this crisis is this happens in a moment of exceptional making and do-it-yourself and networking tools, right? This thing happens when we have Zoom on the table and Dispatch and Facebook. And so, you know, as you point out, we're basically taking these things and remixing them, you know, very much, Rabbi, kind of in the, you know, in the secular or reform tradition where people take a little Buddhism, a little Judaism, a little this, a little that. Well, now we're doing it out of necessity and at scale.
Well, it turns out that this is in this real crisis in which there is real loss, there is real trauma, is interfacing with a variety of other vectors and trajectories and trends. So one of the trends is, in general, we're mixing and blending and bending and switching in our demographics, in our marriage patterns, in our who we hang out with, in the foods we eat. And so that mixing and blending and bending and switching is now happening right inside of dealing with real life issues like grieving or loss. And people wind up with this permission to draw on anything they can. And it's almost like modularity. We know this from the innovation world. It's not inventing something brand new. It's putting things together in new ways that actually, and here I want to use a sort of innovation world term, get the job done. There's real job to get done when you have loss. It's not a game. And that job either gets done or doesn't. And if it doesn't get done, there's arrested development and there's real distortions and there's no capacity for illumination and creativity if that job doesn't get done. Because out of the tears of grief come profound creative outbursts, both internally and externally. So that's actually Mickey's story, which is happening all over the world, all over the world, actually. Right. In which,
one of the other
something really, I think
one of the other hallmarks of what's going on right now is scale. So this is, there's death, but there's grieving also, as I think you pointed out to us, for perhaps lost futures or our dreams that didn't work out. And there's, there's a path, right? There's a set of things we go through when we come to grips with loss.
Yeah. So it seems to me that first there's this sort of physical loss of somebody, and then there's a continuum of tragedy on that. A father is different than a child, God forbid. And so you wind up, so there's first of all, understanding who you are in the drama of the loss. Then there's a lot of different kinds of loss happening. Okay. There's physical loss, but there's loss of dreams, there's loss of roles, right? I'm a 62-year-old who was always in the job of protecting my children. That's how I experienced it. I became a grandparent 10 weeks ago. And I'm the role of grandfather, I can't own. The role of protecting my children the same way I can't own, because their job is to protect me more at 62 than at 29. And so there's loss of role. Then there's loss of business. There's loss of energy. There's so many. I guess
even our dreams, right? The dream of what our career would be. The dream of
people who put
amazing loss at the moment.
Right? Put tremendous psychic energy and financial energy, intellectual energy to ventures that even they did great. It doesn't matter. They're going under in this period. Yeah. So there's so many different kinds of losses. Now, here's what we know about the grieving process, right? You have to go through these stages, not in a linear way, in a sort of spiral ongoing way. You have to be able, everyone denies first. By the way, the culture denies, we're going to go back to normal. There's a blitz for normality. That's denial. Okay. Yeah. Then there's anger that we have to go through, and there's a bargaining with it. If I could just get through this, just get through this. There's depression and sadness, and those tears that are real, that the culture is not phenomenal on. Remember, our culture is fundamentally about marketizing grief as quickly as possible and commodifying grief. Grief is because grief is very, very destabilizing. Then there's acceptance, and then there's meaning making. And if you drum to the meaning making, you miss the illumination that comes and the power that comes from being able to mine and excavate the new empty space.
Talk about meaning making a little more, if you could, Irwin. Can you explain a little more about that sixth part? Because I think a lot of people have heard about the 5 phases, and originally it was kind of described linearly. But your point is, it's actually all this stuff is overlapping. It's more of a entanglement world in that regard. Right. But talk about meaning making, because I think you have a kind of a point of view on this.
There's two qualities, meaning making. You have to be re-embedded in some sort of community, webs of relationships, re-anchored, because you lose your father and your anchoring gets lost. Right? It doesn't matter if he was in his 80s, and it all that doesn't matter. There's a lost, where am I kind of thing. Okay. And then there's a creating a new story. The new story is the meaning making. You already started that story, right? So now anyone who's listening to this has a story about your father. There's something about making and light and playfulness, and oh my God, out of this car came a Christmas ornament, which is the birth of a child, which death and birth, you probably weren't even aware of it that way. Death and birth got put together in the same story. That's meaning making.
You said there's, one of the things you talked about a little bit when we were talking, and I think you were just actually helping me through my own personal stuff. It kind of, it felt very personal as we were talking. You were talking a little bit about how there is this getting out of yourself, and it's, in effect, it's kind of a positive contagion in some ways. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that idea?
Well, I mean, I think that's where we, I always say, I say we're stuck very often between the mirror and the mask, right? The mirror we look into and it's narcissistic and it's surface and you don't see deep, and that's the mirror. And then there's the mask. We go outside and it's all about hiding. What are we hiding? We're hiding from ourselves and we're hiding from others. And to be able to come out from behind the mask and out from the mirror and look really, really at reality. What are we seeing? You look at that casket, or you look at what it really means to not have your father, and you look at that reality. And that vulnerability, it turns out the vulnerability on an interior level is a source of tremendous, tremendous possibility and creativity. Doesn't mean we want it that way. If you're speaking in the external world, the innovation world, you say, what's the problem you most want to solve, right? An innovator who is not passionate about the problem is probably not going to be a great innovator. That's the external version of that, because the problem is the vulnerability at the outside, some real problem you want to solve that you go to sleep thinking about, you wake up. Well, it's the same on the vulnerability side. Just the culture's not quite as good on that side.
So, one of the things we talked about that I'd like to drill in a little more on is sort of the wisdom that you find in various classic religions. I mean, the reason some of these rituals and religious stuff, the reason they've lasted for so long is they've lasted for so long. They've actually worked for us. And there's sort of a wisdom component, and then there's a practice component. Can you elaborate just a little bit on what you see?
So,
you're a rabbi, but you also,
I don't want to reduce all of religion to one thing, but look, all of these wisdom traditions, right, at some level, are making a claim that what you see is not the complete, what you feel, what you see is not the complete reality. There's something deeper that you can tap into. And so there's some movement from death to life and that movement from death to life, that movement from despair to hope, that movement from slavery to freedom, that movement from darkness to light, that's the movement that all wisdom traditions, whatever they are, however they teach, right, from darkness to enlightenment, they all try to do that. Then every single tradition, but I don't care what the tradition is, because it could be the maker tradition, right, the psychological tradition, the innovation tradition, the medical tradition, the musical tradition, they all have practices. And here's an example of a practice that's well known in Jewish life. Okay, perfect. There's a prayer called the Kaddish. It's the mourner's prayer. The prayer simply says, may reality be great, may reality be blessed, may reality be magnified, may reality continue to grow and grow and grow. And there's no mention of death in the prayer. But people who've had a loss for the 30 days, if it's a parent, 11 months, say this every single day. And what they're actually saying, this practice is, there actually is a hole in my universe. There's a tear in my heart. There is a gap, a space, an abyss that somehow I have to cross over. There's something off in the universe itself, in the cosmos itself, because my father died, and that's my universe. And so this practice developed over the last 1,000 years to get together with a group of other people who've had this loss in one's community and say, may the universe be whole again. May the cosmos be blessed again. And that allows us to identify our own loss with the universe and then say to the universe, get bigger, get bigger, get bigger, get bigger, which of course is saying to ourselves, we'll be okay, we'll be okay, we'll be okay. In fact, there'll be life here in ways we can't even imagine.
I'm so glad you said that again. I mean, I just have to say, I feel like the rending, and I think I'm probably hiding from it right now. It's okay, and we're using things like this conversation to, maybe I'll just keep busy enough, but I think this notion of may reality be greater, it's not saying forget that. It's saying actually it's been rent, it's been pulled apart, but it's not ever going to be the same. We're going to put some Band-Aids or stitch it up, or we're going to come up with an interesting way to weave it back together again. But that break in reality actually will be the strongest part later, because you've been through that, or you can actually stand on that again. And,
correct.
And now,
Yeah. And the space itself that's open is open for something new, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're a week into your death of your father, so we can't say what is the new yet that what are the enlightenments, what's the illumination? We don't know yet. It wouldn't be right? But
Irwin, I've got one question before we kind of bring Tim into the conversation.
Yeah.
We've been talking about how on a personal level, there's this loss we covered over, but what's new is going to be different. I think this is true on a societal level. Our world is going through a loss that's affecting everybody in a very connected world. In fact, we're up at about, I think in the US alone, we're passing through 150,000 deaths right now, I guess, for COVID. We've exceeded Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we're inventing all these rituals. One of the things we keep talking about here is how will the world be different? And I'm wondering how all of this experimentation with ritual and spirituality may change how we're looking at our religions, which have been under a lot of pressure, and what new things may be part of our world spiritually and ritual wise after we've done this moment where we've been separate and more alone and using technology to connect, and perhaps seeing more starkly the role of ritual and knowing more about it, because as you pointed out, we have to do it ourselves. We can't outsource it.
No, I think that, there's a lot of things to talk about this. I'll give you two things that my take are going to happen. One is the disruption of religion was coming, but it was amongst the last sectors to be disrupted for a variety of reasons. And the sector is going to be really significantly disrupted now because people, to make it crass, business models of religion, like the business models of many institutions that have to go remote and in which content is getting cheaper and cheaper, in which I may not need all the capital, all the capital expenses. This is really, really going to affect institutional religion. That's the same with the professionalization of religion, the deprofessionalization of religion, which is the meaning-making aspect of religion, is going to be accelerated in this. Downside of this, a lot of people are going to be out of work, and these institutions, which did get a lot of jobs done, are not going to get those jobs done anymore. The upside of this is the jobs historically religion got done, in this case, helping people grieve, are going to permeate other societies, other sectors. You're not going to be able to be a conventional business and not deal with people's loss anymore. And this is a perfect example, right? This topic would never have been in this sort of venue. And Mickey would have never been this personal in this sort of venue. And that means the boundaries of the venues, the boundaries of the sectors are being permeable. Just like we're now inside people's home in our business world, and our cats come by and our children come by and you see our houses. So that is a very, very significant shift. The jobs, historically, the most important jobs that religion got done, right? All the life cycle ones and moral accountability, okay? The issues of moral accountability and creating webs of relationships and belonging, the jobs of businesses, the next round, and how they figure out getting a lot of these done is going to be really, really fascinating.
That seems like a remarkable setup for our next guest, a person who makes his living looking at disruption in the future and trying to do so with perhaps more soul than other people in Silicon Valley, Tim Chang. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Peter. It's a real honor to be here. Excited to be part of the conversation.
Yes. Well, look, you and I have known each other for years, and you have been kind of at the forefront of how technology can be part of presence, meditation, wellness. You were investing in quantified self and gaming technologies, and more recently looking at the frontiers of psychedelics for healing. And now in the middle of this moment, you find yourself in the middle of working with Zoom on the reinvention of death. You've got a nonprofit working on that. And you and I have been to a couple of online funerals. So from the world of innovation, as the Rabbi set up, this is a startling moment. So perhaps you can give us a little tour of kind of what's going on in the tech community, and also how your vision of all this is applying to what's going on today. Sure.
You know what that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Whew, talk about a common necessity right now. I'm seeing something beautiful in all this chaos, which is that we all globally face a common mission now, which is our wellness, our health, our resiliency in the face of this global pandemic. Talk about a killer application, full pun intended, for all of the entrepreneurs working on solutions. Instead of our old models of like, let's grow some unicorns, let's seek some big valuations, let's go break stuff and hack things. I think this puts a much deeper sense of purpose and mission on towards what we're all working now. And something I'm seeing in this is that quarantine, I heard this great saying, it's as if Mother Nature has sent us all to our rooms to think about what we've done. And so in that stillness, in that inability to gather physically, we have to reinvent everything. Our behaviors, our ways of doing business, our ways of communicating and connecting. Going back to first principles in all of the things that we used to take for granted. It's traumatic. It's also very powerful, and it will lead to a lot of new behaviors, routines, rituals, tools, resources, all these things. The thing that I keep coming back to is that humans were meant to be tribal creatures. Since time immemorial, we keep trying to synthesize ways to create deeper, broader communal experiences. We see that with the younger generation today. Everybody's so interested in co-working, co-living. Now we have to figure out how to do that at a distance virtually. So this necessity, this common adversarial challenge, I think will really bond humanity. I've always seen that humans, we bond through shared challenge. It's like taking on that hero's journey together. And with that, I think we'll see, I hope, more businesses with heart behind them instead of just, profit maximization, shareholder value type of mantra that we had before. If I could lay out for you one framework I've been thinking about, this might be even as ambitious as the birth of the next phase of the web. I call Web 1.0 organization of static pages that was organizing info, text, hyperlinks. Web 2.0 brought about widgets and interactive pieces of media, audio, visual, etc. Web 3.0, we started having social web and mobile, which brought about applications and mobile, kind of functionality, social networks. I think what we're seeing now is Web 4.0 might be the birth of experiential web. So a link could take you to any number of things: a multiplayer Zoom room, a Discord chat session, a Twitch stream, all sorts of things that are defined as many-to-many live interactions. And that's something we've never seen before. And we have to create those now. If you've attended any of these novel new dance parties, yoga lessons, all the grand experiments that people around the world are doing to foster connection and interactivity over whatever tools we can find, that's like the blooming of a million flowers out there. And some of these use cases, I think, will be so compelling that even after we can gather together, these use cases will stay. And that's what's really exciting me, is that we're going to see this birth of this fourth web, maybe even a new, experiential markup language for how we denote these new rooms and experiences that we're going to when we click a link. Peter, you and I attended this party called Immersiverse just a couple weekends ago, right? Which was almost like a micro version of Burning Man, but done virtually over Zoom rooms and all sorts of other things. That really opened my eyes. I was like, wow, there are so many interactive multiplayer experiences that are going to come out of this. Some of these will result in new businesses, new business models, new platforms, new rituals altogether. I think the next one that everyone should check out, MAPS, is a nonprofit that's famous, a multidisciplinary association for psychedelic science. They've been advancing FDA research of psychedelics for medicine. They're throwing their fundraiser Bicycle Day event in this sort of multiverse online format. And I think tickets just went on sale, but that's going to be another preview of the kind of way you could hold a digital festival online. Some of those experiences will be so novel, I bet you they will persist even after you can do these formats and galas in person.
I mean, one thing that's remarkable about this is we're talking about a font of innovation that basically went on over the last 28 or 30 days. Like a month ago, we were still complaining that, Facebook's captured and Roger McNamee wrote a book, and are there trolls in there, and what could possibly disrupt whatever got done in those sets of silos and models.
Yes, this.
And then, right, that was a month ago, right? And actually, nobody could quite, if you ask Tristan Harris, who runs the Center for Humane Technology, what's next, he's like, we got to get to something. Then this thing happens, and basically everybody's been coding and inventing, and when we look over their shoulders, you've had some, unfortunately, we've both had experiences with online funerals. We heard one a week ago. We have one tomorrow. We heard from Mickey's. to talk a little bit about just what's literally going on in this interface between, I don't know, those of us who are users who are faced with this, and then the interface with the tech world is trying to adapt as we're squeezing and dealing with all these tools, and what companies are beginning to do right now.
It's a great way to put it, because you know what? Zoom was designed for business conferencing. It wasn't meant to do digital funerals. And now, just that other night last week, we had 108 people, and they're trying to figure out how to create a new ritual for digital memorial real time on a tool not meant for that. So we're going to see people trying to adapt existing off-the-shelf tools, again, Twitch, YouTube, Discord, all these things for all sorts of emergent use cases. That's going to create the need for new tools, new moderation systems, content offering, all sorts of things that will bring about, again, from this necessity, as we take all the offline behaviors we had to figure out before and then put them into a virtual or remote setting, right? These are conferences, these are fundraising galas, this is tutorials, therapy, training, instruction, all sorts of services that were once done in person are getting reinvented real time. I got my own training in death midwifery from INELDA, the Association for End-of-Life Doulas, and I was just thinking to myself, death doulas, they normally do their work in person. They're on the sidelines right now, but how important would it be to be able to have them provide on-demand sort of support for end-of-life processes remotely? Zoom, Facebook portals, even cell phones. Because a lot of people in ICUs, they have no connection. Nobody can visit. They're often begging nurses if they can just connect with family members just over the nurse's cell phone, right? So that's an example of an immediate necessity.
I want to bring Irwin in, who is shaking his head, and I think seeing how this compares to perhaps a few thousand years of other traditions.
No, I like I'm listening to Tim, and who I just got to meet today. So like it's amazing, and I'm saying, oh my God, no pun implied, as a religious leader, like, yikes! This is exactly what a founding moment is. That you have these new technologies that emerge. Just remember, there's not a ritual that any religion knows that wasn't an innovation at one moment. All a ritual that is an innovation that made it, and that's all a tradition is. It's an innovation that made it, and so you wind up with a founding moment in which, not surprisingly, new technologies with new delivery systems wind up getting real jobs done, and when creative people are willing to bring their creativity and sense of heart and purpose to this world, which let's be honest, this is one of the shifts. A lot of the best and brightest have not been involved in quotation marks this domain. And wow, if this could happen now, imagine what happens if all of this technological creativity comes to bear on the real jobs to get done in moving abundance to human well-being and prosperity. Wow.
Tim, one of the big complaints about Silicon Valley is that the talent goes flying off to gamification, or it goes flying off to some enterprise stuff, but there are real problems to get done. Is this possibly signaling a shift in where talent goes?
It absolutely is. And it's because we have this common crisis that's unifying all of us. Talk about an invitation to step up into purpose. I've never seen more entrepreneurs and founders called to that action of helping and serving. And that's what's beautiful. It's moving away from just services for the 1%ers. It's really about how do we help. And so I think, gosh, again, talking about that killer app, that really unifies people to work on things that matter. This is going to be, I think, the start of a bit more soul, a bit more heart to Silicon Valley startups, because we're thinking about problems that need true solving. And, to your point, Peter, Tristan's a friend. We work together a lot on this fighting digital addiction. I think this might be the moment we start to use, like Irwin called the founding moment, to use the same technology. We were worried about distracting us, disconnecting each other, to now reconnect ourselves. Connection with ourselves, connection with those around us, the connection with the broader community. This notion of can tech put us back in touch with me? That ripples out to the connection with we, that ripples out to connection with all. And so I'm really excited about that part of, again, creation of new rites, rituals, routines.
So I've got a question, and I think it's really for Tim and Irwin both. Irwin, you talked about the best and brightest were not in this domain, and I think what you meant was organized religion. And so I want to understand that. But I think also, Peter and I both have been exploring this notion of complexity science, and this notion that in some sense, a lot of times makers and the tech community is all about sort of the church of what's now. It's all about sort of empirics, lots and lots and lots of cool things, see what sticks, see what you can get a business model, not necessarily about theory. Einstein would be laughed out of a maker lab, right? He'd be like, who are you? It took 28 years before his little paper when he was a patent guy actually got tested, to see about lensing between stars. So how do we make sure that these new people who are entering, right, the people who are excited about this, the possible new founders, the possible new people who actually see this as something and have felt it viscerally, how do we make sure we don't throw the baby out the bathwater? We don't end up with none of the wisdom or the practices that actually stood the test of a few thousand years in this process. And I'm curious, actually, for both of you, like, what's your take on this?
I mean, it's so like jazz, I mean, I think, first of all, the people that, again, as a quotation marks outsider, the people that I've met in the tech world, in the maker world, it's not that these, again, I'm sure as an outsider, I projected certain idealism. Many of them actually want to get real jobs done. I think that when you add to the now a little bit more reality of the heart, I don't want people in the past. I just want the now to be a touch, have more depth. It's like 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional. So I love that 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. So all I want is now 4.0. I don't want now, the killer app is now 1.0, or the killer app is a very narrow understanding of now. But what is the app that has a broader understanding of now? In some traditions, the name for God is now, is present tense.
Beautiful.
That's the name for God. And so, like, if a maker who is deeply in the now, a tech person who's saying, this new power, it's even more than fire. I have this capacity because of all the variety of things that can converge in the new technologies to really meet the problems of now. Oh my God. What do you think a cross was? What do you think a Mandela was? What do you think a Jewish star was? These were technologies. These were makers. The makers developed something to speak to a real fundamental need. So I don't want theory. First of all, as a religion person, I believe that practice always comes before theory. Always becomes before theory.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
First. So in fact, one of the reasons that religion got so screwed up is across the board, and this is especially in Protestantism, theory and theology began to win out. But it's not about theology. I can't tell you, you show me your checkbook, you show me how you spend money, you show me how you spend time, and I'll tell you your theology. So I'm much more interested in the making and doing, and then let people I'm happy to look at the making and doing and say, oh my God, do you see what you're doing? Do you actually understand the range of what it is you're doing? Do you understand to get everybody to salute what you did in creating a ritual of me? Do you even you created birth and death in the story you told? Theory comes after practice. I
totally agree. I love this point because I think this notion of practice becomes theory. I mean, I think the point is sort of you have to try something. Like, just do something. Like, make. One of the best things I ever learned about making was make for action, not for archiving. In other words, make the wrong thing, make it really rigorously wrong, and then give people the ability to tear it apart. And they will actually show you what you really needed to do by the act of them tearing it apart and recombining it, right? Make it out of foam core, have them tear it apart. And this notion, though, that when you step back, though, you look for pattern, right? So theory, the scientific method, my brother's a high energy physicist. And as a child, he wanted to be that at 6, and he became that at Bell Labs and everything, and Fermi and CERN. He would tell me that there are experimentalists and there are theorists. And he's an experimentalist. Like, he loves building the tools to try to figure out how to discover like the top quark or something. But the idea was that they were inspired by the theorists, but they often stumbled on things that then theorists would spend years trying to figure out what the heck that was. And it's a feedback loop. And I guess I just want to make sure that we get both sides of it. because theory gives us the power to predict the future, right? If I drop something, it falls. That's cool. It doesn't just fall on Tuesdays. It doesn't just fall here in this show. It falls all the time. Gravity's not open sourced. It was burned in right around the first second of the universe. And so that means we can trust it. It's a contract, right? And so I want things that give me predictability, but also I want things that can't compress, right? You can't compress a person's life into E equals MC squared. The uncompressible and the compressible are both very powerful.
Beautiful.
Tim, you look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to bounce in on there. Irwin's points were spot on. One thing what I'd like to offer is what I keep seeing is that there's this false dichotomy between the scientific and the sacred. I think if you go down either rabbit hole far enough, it's as if two, 180-degree kind of arrows circumnavigate a globe and meet at the other end. And I'm seeing this in the tech world too, because with all this resilience tech, people are now realizing, oh, wait, the future is plant-based foods, and maybe it's, community and living together and in harmony with nature. And it's really funny because these strike young people as grand insights, but it's basically elder wisdom we've known forever. And so there's this joke I say, it's going back for the future, going way back for the future.
Back for the future. That's good.
And I mean, every generation goes through this. You have to have this life.
You have to, yeah.
Where you think you came up with it on your own, but it's been around since millennia. But the point is, the sense of ownership is when you walk the path and figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we have
co-creation, the owning it. Yeah, every generation have to own it, and we have to be good ancestors in that process of kind of helping.
Yeah.
But we're not going to be around for some of this stuff. And I think if they don't feel it, they won't defend it.
I'd like to this notion that we are all at a moment of coming together to reprogram, and large communities suddenly are seeing that these are the prescient ideas of the day, is a great opportunity to bring in someone who has studied and practiced this for years. My good friend Jen Sander, who is also runs global innovation at Burning Man, which is a community that has been practicing these ideas and arguably has been a sleeper cell in rehearsal for this moment for years. But you're seeing kind of a grand reprogramming going on, and I'd love to get your perspective and kind of what your research has shown you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for having me. It's interesting what some of you guys are talking about at the very end there, just to trail off of it for a minute about the idea of some of this has happened in the past before, and, we're creating examples of change right now, but were there other systems in place in the past where we were more like this or what have you? I think we're in a really amazing moment of reprogramming right now, and Burning Man certainly has a lot of examples there, and some of this has already been said by you guys, but this moment of adaptability that's occurring where we kind of both lean on our rituals to help us get through the unknown, but at the same time are in a little bit of a pickle where we have to be more resourceful because there's a restraint, or we don't have all the ingredients, or we are in a crisis, or in a moment where we have to recalibrate even the ritual that we once would lean on to get us through the circumstances, such as potentially not being able to be with your loved ones during a funeral. What's actually happening, though, is that people are reimagining their ritual due to this sort of constraints, from everything from, hey, let's have that funeral on Zoom, and wow, wasn't it amazing to see all the different people's lives that Dad touched, versus us doing it perfectly with just 6 people being able to show up. You know what I mean? To the kind of funnier things that I've seen of like sort of people, baking all the time, and then wanting to have their croissants on, Sunday morning with their family, but not necessarily having the ingredients. It sort of reminds you of, the chapter in The Joy of Cooking, where there was a section around substitution and learning how to do things with substitution. And some of the things that happen as a result of that, which you guys kind of touched on also, was that often that substitution or that need to reimagine the ritual leads to new innovations, right? And so that new innovation is very, very awe-inspiring. One example that I have from Burning Man that I like to share is actually that of the lamplighters. So for those of you who have been to Burning Man, you may know this, you may not. For those of you who haven't, Burning Man is very much a a pop-up city. It was a experiment that eventually started to crave order. And now looks very much like a real city, and has actually, in fact, learned from real cities in designing the way it looks today. But there was a time before that order started to organically occur. And one story I like to tell is that of the Lamplighters. So basically, when the man burnt, which was one of our iconic structures, people would have difficulty getting back to their campsites because there was no longer there was no longer a structure in place to help them navigate the blank canvas that they were on, but also there wasn't enough light. So we brought lanterns. Lanterns were brought and left near the base of the man, but people would pick up the lanterns and just walk away. Right. So a great example and comparison to where we're at right now is really this story. So in trying to figure out how could we not create too much order or structure, but allow for more light so people don't get lost, what could we do? And eventually what happened was this idea, this make-believe idea that came out of pure imagination led to a new ritual whereby different members of the community could be honored for their ideas, for their participation, and actually in a ritualistic way, carry the lanterns on a stick and hang them on lampposts so that people wouldn't walk away with the light. So we have this kind of very clear example of how at Burning Man, we create the permission for the imagination to happen, and then it leads to new rituals. So we're starting to see now, the blank canvas of the constraint that we're in isolation sometimes leads to new substitutes, which leads to new innovation. And sometimes the new innovation is even better than before.
An interesting point. I was just saying, an interesting point about Burning Man. Sometimes people think, well, this is a really artificial thing you do for a week up in the desert. But part of it is because it's such a harsh environment, it forces people to MacGyver and come up with new stuff and solve problems, as you just described, right?
Right. I think we just sort of touched on that a little bit. So there's definitely some commonalities between being in a landscape where there is a restraint, such as limited resources like the desert, or in a crisis. I mean, another really great example is the recession, in 2008, when there was no jobs, there was no jobs, no guarantee of getting a degree would lead to anything at all. So this kind of like resurgence of entrepreneurial thinking or entrepreneurial learning happened, where people had to get creative. They invented services, they invented different forms of disruption and alternative entrepreneurial pursuits, and that largely came from a sort of a place of scarcity in a way. And so, but I just want to point out that the power of ritual also does allow for, in some religions, an opportunistic motivator for reimagining and taking a break and bringing creativity into the ecosystem. And some of those things are like, the Shabbat, or even just the idea of the weekend, where we take a break on the weekend to do something different than we normally would. However, even then, in those positive examples of ritualizing, doing things for no reason, it's really not very often that we actually do things for no reason. I mean, it's been almost like poo-pooed in society to play, or to get lost in time, or do something without a purpose, or prototype and not be overly committed to the outcomes. So, it's really interesting that, we have this great example where we're in right now that reflects on, not just taking a break and being stuck in a moment, a blank canvas moment, but also ritualizing the idea of authentically taking a break in order to reevaluate. And that's where the sort of bottom-up emergent innovation and thinking starts to come from. Interestingly, we weren't always like this. Festivals used to be, in some cases, religious activities that occurred to bring people together and experiment and play in order to then drive more innovation. The Mayans, for example, they used to throw festivals before they would build their cities. But then, somewhere along the line, society got too linear. We went from playing and making to knowing to kind of thinking we knew what we had to do and making a result as a result of that, and then playing if and when we had free time.
Jen, let's bring Irwin. I'd love to bring Irwin back in, because I think what Jen's describing in the microcosm of Burning Man is what you were describing that was going on in early religions, where they had to get work done first, and then eventually it became a ritual.
Yeah. So I first of all, Jen, I need to process everything she said first, but I think there's this when you're in a founding moment, and the lamp lighter was the perfect example. A real need emerges organically, something gets created, and then people turn that into a quotation marks ritual. It's not a ritual until it's ritualized. and the danger of the ritual, I want to talk about the danger of the ritualizing side, because that way we can own the power of the creativity side today, because the permission is really, really important. That Jen is talking about permission. There is such massive permission needed to be granted, even though we live in a culture we think everything is permitted. She is so right about that. Mm-hmm. And that is that ritual has this other very funky role when it's ritualized, and that is it dosages reality for us, because reality is too hot to handle. So it dosages, like a dosage, like, a dose, right? It dosages grief. It dosages awe. It dosages pain, right? So ritual can dosage the real pain that's out there of millions and millions of people who are not going to have work. And especially those of us who are very, 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 very into ritual. Okay, ritual can block the real pain, because the pain would blow you apart. So there's a stabilizing, anchoring, light giving when it's dark role. Okay, and there's also a destabilizing role that ritual has to play, and that interplay. And I think Burning Man gets that perfectly. And of course, it has to, because it burns it down again. So you're forced to. Like it's, that's the famous story of burning the raft after you get across. Why? Because it forces you then to bring all the creativity that got you to build the raft again to create something new that gets you from here to there. And that's what we're talking about, the journey from here to there.
So the kind of experimentation culture that leads to this sort of bottom-up innovation that we're trying to get more of, it often evolves as a result of circumstance and can become new ritual, but it also sometimes blinds us, right? It sometimes prevents us from actually seeing the new opportunities at hand, because we are so distracted by the prescriptive nature of the rituals. And so in a disaster, it becomes apparent how we can reimagine things. It's also very Darwinian to, survival of the fittest and trial of error there. But at the same time, how do we do this for opportunistic moments, right? And unfortunately, in the opportunistic moments, ritual looks a little bit more like routine, right? It looks looks more like routine than ritual. So basically, what we're getting at now is, I used to spend a lot of time sitting with Larry Harvey, who was one of the founders, the key founder of Burning Man, who passed away almost about 2 years, just about 2 years now. And we used to think a lot about, how can we bring this culture, this innovation and play and this, permission culture to society at large. Because if we could, then, maybe we could proliferate something, a mentality that helped people step out of their routine and realize that maybe they should do different things, and to question themselves frequently. Almost, how do we ritualize breaking routine? How do we ritualize creating space for the unknown? And one of the things Larry used to sometimes say was, when we think we know where we're going, we're often most lost, right? So we have to keep that mentality of rediscovery alive.
I would love to, at this point, bring the rest of our panelists back, because I think this is such a rich innovation conversation.
Let me finish this sort of which is that basically we have the opportunity to ritualize doing things for no reason. And that's where our creativity starts. And in order to do that, you know, there's a few things that still exist. I just want to point out the word company, right? So some of you might know this, but the word company, which generally entails like a purpose or a mission or a group of people with a certain, you know, activity that they're consulting to or speaking to or providing service on. The root of that word is actually compagno, which is Latin, and it has to do with breaking bread, right? So one of the early playgrounds in history, one of the early sort of environments for reimagining and taking a break was in fact, and probably today is still in fact, most happens within the dinner, within the dinner experience, the dinner table, where we break bread. It's the only place where, you know, you can convince that busy business guy to sit down, talk to people he has no idea why he needs to meet with them, have food because he just has to have food, and actually take a moment to use his hands, get tactile, break bread, and discover new things and have those serendipitous moments, those random collisions. So I think it's very interesting to think of the root of the word company, which entails commerce and business, came from a moment of creating space for the unknown. So how, in this moment in time that we're in, can we say, wow, we're in a great reprogramming moment? How can we leverage the fact that we're learning through a sense of, in some cases, constraint, to put systems in place in society at large, in our local communities and neighborhoods that allow for the ritualization of this unknown, this space for unknown.
Hey Peter, it looks like we're hitting 5 o'clock here on the West Coast, and we want to make sure that anybody who needs to leave can cut out. But we typically run this into overtime, and actually, just what Jen said just there, I feel like I have like 42 questions. I wonder if we want to just sort of give everyone a chance to kind of, if you want to cut out now, cut out. We're going to keep going because this is like a dinner table conversation.
Actually, I have a question for Tim. First of all, talk about necessity and invention. At Burning Man itself, this notion of grief and reverence wasn't the original idea. The temple at Burning Man was a thing that got created to meet this need, and arguably it's one of those things that's going to spill out into the virtual world. So, and then the second question is, you know, here
Wait,
you
what
are.
was the question there, Peter? What was the question?
Oh, yeah,
because I think the temple is a stunning example of embracing something that was created by one artist, and I think Jen expanding on that would be
Well, I don't know what your
powerful.
question, Peter. I can line it up for
Yeah,
somebody
what's the
else
question?
by explaining it slightly more. So the temple, you know, the temple is a very supreme example. The temple was one man's art project, and well, not one man's. It was a vision, you know, and it was initially an art project that was created actually to honor somebody who died of suicide. And so that was the intention of the creation of the first temple. However, how the participants began to interact with the art project was a completely different thing, which is one of the things we learned from prototyping in general, and why prototyping is important is because more people can interact with said things. But anyhow, the response was so powerful. People going there to mourn, people going there to release, people going there to heal, to pray and to do poetry, that the organization Burning Man decided to actually create a temple every year. But in the spirit of maintaining the sort of curiosity and rebirth process with the unknown, it was decided to have a different group of artists come together to put forward propositions and proposals of what they believed a temple to be, which then is voted on and decided collectively every single year. And now I'll just close up on that in saying that as a result of these temples, not only have we seen a whole bunch of different architectural feats and different versions of what it means to have a temple, and to look at the cycle of life and death, but we also have been able to educate large groups of people on learning how to use like laser cutters and build and get involved in local.
Yeah, building these temples is not trivial. They're giant. You know, we helped one year at Autodesk. Carl Bass's own private shop, the CEO, is probably better than most people's maker labs, and helped build it. But then, I think the important point that you're building on, Jen, is this notion that a lot of people in the news media hear about this weird thing called Burning Man. It looks like a lot of half-naked people, and they're covered in like dust and sequins, and the sparkle ponies that come out for the big rave on Saturday night. Half of those people, like 40,000 people, stay through Sunday night, and then at sunset, and I experienced this, and I just was crying and weeping in some ways. 40,000 people are sitting in a giant circle around this temple that has all the memories of everyone who died that year, pinned up within this temple. And then it bursts into flames at sunrise, and you're sitting on the ground, 40,000 people, and you can hear a pin drop. You can hear individual people hitching and breathing and having a hard time breathing. And you get to sort of do that. And Leonard Nimoy actually passed away the first year I was there. And so there was this huge, beautiful memorial to Leonard Nimoy, if you're a Star Trek fan. And it was beautiful. And then I brought my son to the last one that I went. And he's, in his 30s, so he's not a young spring chicken. But we just sat there and we just watched this beautiful, weird thing happen. And I don't know if it was David Best who did the first thing, but he was an architect experimenting.
Yeah.
But then people did stuff he didn't expect to that thing. And I think that's where you were going, Jen, is that leaving space for like the white space, the space for things to experiment. Well, you even said leaving space as a structural element, like leave space for experimentation. You had said the other day, and I just love that. It just
even beyond that, David has since been commissioned to build temples all over the world. And
Ireland and things like that for Northern Ireland,
where he was commissioned by an arts and technology collective that was aware of a kind of a very severe dispute, long-term dispute between and youth, and rioting was happening and all kinds of things. And so actually what they did is they built the temple in a location that could be viewed equally between both towns. And they brought in the kids to learn how to, to the Fab Labs, to the maker spaces, to learn how to build together. And then when the temple was resurrected, it was basically something that both towns and both communities could be equally proud of.
Yeah, they had like a burn night where they were burning the hell out of actually the cities, and this redirected their energy to actually both the sort of that were from the IRA and the people that were from the British side were coming together in a weird way and actually being okay. It was like a international symbol of peace.
I just want to point out that those sparkly people are okay too. Okay.
Of course. I was one of those on Saturday night. Peter is the king of sparkle pony, but yeah, true.
And doing things that seem silly and seem novel and seem purposeless, seem like a waste of time, like costuming, etc. Those things are the same things that lead to the bottom-up emergence. It's doing stuff for no reason and being silly that then leads to the new ritual.
Thank you for saying that. Because I also feel like it could come off as I'm like dismissing that. You're totally right. Yeah. That's the experimentation. Not everybody experiments with everything. And even the idea that the ritual ends, right? After the temple burns, you go back to normal life. You don't dress up in the weird tutus and the sparkle stuff, whatever, when you're but you might bring a little bit with you.
By the way, I'd like to point out
that's where you're experimenting.
If you looked at the online raves or the online activity like Immersiverse that we were in, much of the innovation was how the hell can we be silly with Zoom? How do we introduce these personal connections, the ritual elements in this business instrument and get what we need, in the last couple of weeks? I wanted to bring Tim and Irwin here in because, Burning Man is this contained experience full of innovation. And as we're beginning to see, the stuff that went on there, as a lot of burners would like to tell you, may well be some of the code of where we're headed, right? Burning Man has 10 principles. There are 5 about the individual, 5 about the group, 2 about commerce, decommodification. These are not unlike where we're headed. And so the question is, I guess, Tim, you suggested that the tech world is beginning to embrace these principles. And Irwin, you've suggested that the world of wisdom is ripe for disruption. So I'm kind of interested, like in our what's the glide path or the footprint or the roadmap that, like, something's going on here that would be significant to Sand Hill Road in about 15 minutes, but certainly significant to all of us. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Big time. I wanted to say, I live in Marin County. It's a pretty privileged place, but climate effects plus COVID made even rich, entitled people realize that, maybe we should be more resilient. Maybe we need to be more decentralized and organize ourselves in local ways. And all my friends in Marin suddenly realized, oh my gosh, this is like Burning Man in real life. We have to take inventory of the skills, the know-how, the resources, the tools that we need. Because we're all burners, that helped us prepare. Many of us had generators, water filtration systems, battery packs, solar chargers, all sorts of those things, right? But what I loved about it is that we could come together as a group, as opposed to the standard response in fear and scarcity is everybody hoards for themselves. This was almost treating it like a giant Burning Man permanent camp, saying, hey guys, I've got some of these, what do you have? If we take inventory of all the skills and things we need, how can we do it as a group? So I think what this invites us to is to swing back towards decentralized, hyper-local, resilient communities. And that's my investment thesis of even resiliency tech. Grow your own food, produce your own energy, filter your own water, all those sorts of things, which, again, Burning Man taught us how to do. So that's the clue, I think, on how we become more regenerative as opposed to purely consumptive. We've been addicted to the church of instant gratification, on-demand, disposable convenience. And I think there's a beautiful lesson in making things inconvenient again. Because the price of convenience is you lose touch with the thing that you made convenient. Once meat is a McNugget, you don't know where it came from.
It's like we're bubble wrapped from reality or something.
Yeah.
We're sort of locked away. I like your framing of resilience tech, right? Or resiliency tech. In nature, and I wrote a book called Trillions that was about how a human body has 50 trillion cells, and we're a complex information system, and we're massively peer-to-peer down to the lowest levels, right? Like, if you cut your leg, it does not call the cloud to figure out how to fix it. You'd be dead. Nature abhors a singleton. Nature likes to memory is so cheap. Every cell in your body has a spare copy of you. That's pretty cool, right? And so it's got layers of complexity. There's an endocrine system and a circulatory and nervous system. But our species would be gone if we didn't have hyper-local ability to be resilient in this stuff. Nature laughs at the fact that there's only one Google. And if you kidnap one of the founders or something, you probably have more power than kidnapping a president's daughter. It's a weird thing. Nature looks at that like, are you crazy? There's no spare copy of Google, because we don't actually think this way. Like, we designed for this limited ability. But in the future, massive hyper-local. That's the reason the rise of the maker movement right now is happening in some ways, is we had this surplus of printers. And surplus of goofy, like, I've got a $300 printer that can do photopolymer, can print 50 things at the same time. It's $200 from Amazon. Photopolymer printers, when I was a product designer, were $250,000. Now they're $240. And some of them, none of this is actually ready for prime time. It's a little clunky, but it's still the idea that like, what if we designed a factory as if we don't know what it will make tomorrow, instead of 9 months to change a factory line? How do we have more resiliency?
Can I jump off all four multiple levels of riffing here? First, this if we use our own sort of take on what it is we're saying, then Peter, to your question, what's going to be the next thing, and inherited wisdom traditions and the interaction with technology and business and reappropriation and ritual and play. If we use actually our own take on this, the only way that'll happen is it'll be emergent. And then the question is, who can model emergence? And it will be, of course, decentralized. That's everything that we've been talking about. In the emergency, I love that companion, that company. In the emergency, there will be emergence. And then the only interesting question is, who do you want to be in the drama? Who's the we in the drama? And there's no whole we. That whole we is the wave. We're particles in the wave. So the real issue is, who's the we? How many of us are going to be what I call early moral adopters of this new way? And one of the real challenges of being an early moral adopter in this sort of dramatic shift that emerges with this kind of mixture of courage and compassion and creativity and curiosity in the midst of all that is on the ground, will it actually promote well-being? On the ground, will people who don't have food, because if we wind up in a creative game in which no one really gets helped, then we're no different than the religions that are soon going to go out of business in the West. And
that doesn't do the job. That's the point, I think, in some ways you're asking.
And so what I love the way Jen sort of described Burning Man is it's both emergent and then it dissolves. It's like it crystallizes and dissolves. It crystallizes and dissolves. And just for Mickey, just because this works so perfectly, there is no Jewish word for funeral. We don't have a word funeral in Hebrew. The word is livaya, which doesn't mean funeral, it means accompaniment. And so we literally don't have a word for what a funeral is. Here's what a funeral is. It's an accompaniment from one way of experiencing reality across some boundary, some border that we know is more permeable. That's the life tech. You're already seeing it. They had words for it, but we didn't know what it was. And so there's no funereal. It's accompaniment. And what do you do as soon as you finish? I don't care if you're awake at the beginning or you're post-wake as Shiva, you eat with someone. That's the point, because eating is the nourishment. And you can only break bread with someone you trust, because otherwise you may be poisoned. So you have to break bread with someone you trust. And fundamental at the core of this, to be able to contain the uncertainty, to be able to contain the ambiguity, to be able to contain the not knowing where we're going, to be able to contain not having a map, but mapping as one goes along, to contain what I call the wandering, is only one thing. Who the hell do you want to wander with? Who do you want to wander with? And it turns out what Burning Man teaches is, you better wander with everybody, from the people who are the weirdest to the people who think they have power in that. You better wander, and that's why it's a metaphor. You better wander with everybody in this world.
Well, hopefully the burners will be the first, to exemplify this, and I think they kind of are already. One of the things that Peter touched on was this idea of radical self-reliance and then collective effort, and I think that the real thing here is actually that if those elements are maintained and demonstrated, potentially through the sort of crisis that we're in, a recalibration will occur. But the question is will that sense of emergence continue? Will we be able to create structures that then continue to evolve over time versus becoming overly linear yet again?
This is, I mean, the question here is also like, are we all in a bubble here? Because we all agree on this, and yet, as you're saying, Jen, if this is a big cultural thing, the implication would be this comfort with uncertainty, this ability, as you're pointing out, Tim, we need more resilient structures at home. Work is going to change. Now we're using the internet differently. Does this diffuse in society? One thing we've seen as every new media type comes out is we have great expectations for television or for the internet, and it kind of gets captured by the advertisers or by extant business models. So what we're discussing here is there going to be this big cultural shift that allows these things to happen? We know we're not going back to normal, but we could go back to something that's more discord and polarized, or something that's together. Normally, we'd ask our religious leader this question, but you have limited investors who you have to explain this to. So I'm kind of interested how this thing plays out in the world of capitalism and things that get built.
For most part, I do see more and more people convinced that we are at late stage consumptive capitalism and are looking for better models. I think the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals provides a really nice North Star set of things to work towards. And more pools of capital and institutions are now asking questions like, hey, how does this business support UN SDGs? The notions of conscious capital, regenerative business models are becoming more and more known. What was really encouraging is before COVID kicked in, Davos, all the talk was about sustainable regenerative models. Benioff himself was calling for the end of shareholder capitalism and more towards inclusive stakeholder capitalism. So I think COVID puts a fine point on it, because I would argue, let's not go back to business as usual. Business as usual were the systems that brought about things like pandemic and climate collapse. How do we do business as better? And that starts from the business models we use. We've been addicted to the church of infinite growth at all costs, but that's not in tune with nature. The only thing that grows at all costs in nature is called cancer until it kills the host organism, right? And so, I mean, in one argument, I could say COVID is Mother Nature's antibodies against us, who are the virus, with the ways that we do things. So again, it starts with within. How do we slow down, examine our own behaviors and expectations? How do those shape our business models, which then shape our behaviors of our companies and institutions? So I'm seeing more
I have
and
a
more
question.
Right.
Tim, I want to see if I can come back in. And this is a question for each of the people who've joined us. This has been just personally just a wonderful. I just like being with you all, and I'm just enjoying it. And I think I end up probably wanting to spend more hours. But I have a question for each of you. You know, one of the things I've been doing, I don't know, Omid, if you can bring in the whiteboard. I've been trying to capture every single session kind of virtually and capture it on an infinite expansive whiteboard. So it's not pretty. I'm not a great doodler or something like that. But in each case, I've been trying to kind of capture and see what happens, and you know, everything in the emergency. Where will be the emergence? Will be the early adopters. Who do you want to be wandering with? You know, it's not ritual until it's ritualized. This is all available to everybody. Actually, what's kind of interesting is it's all of the quarantines that we've been involved in, not just one. So if we were to move over, we'd probably find a quarantine from Wednesday, which was actually about the nonprofit space with Grant from the Heinz Endowments and others. But the question I have for all of you is, you know, I've been trying to also collect, what are you reading now? What's giving you a chance to disconnect and go deep into scholarship? What is something that you're doing not for work, not for something else, but just because you need to escape in some ways? And I'd love each of you to answer me. You know, either what are you reading, what are you doing to kind of unplug in some ways, or give you hope? Because I'm trying to build kind of a playlist of books we should all read and movies we should watch or other things. It doesn't matter to me what it is.
Can I offer one really quick?
You bet.
This has been the perfect opportunity to finally start learning how to grow my own food. So the whole thing about regenerative ag, you know, which is just a rebranding of permaculture, that's one of the keys out of this, right? Instead of industrial centralized farming and everything, it's like, how can we all start to grow our own food? That's a form of resiliency, but it's also, I think, a solution away from some of these, you know, industrial livestock systems, which help create some of these superbugs. So, hey, wet markets, right? So, yeah, it's been a chance to finally learn how to put some planters in my backyard and how to make kale grow or whatever. So
you get very close to reality when you're actually trying to do that stuff. Who else? Jen or Irwin or Peter? What are you reading?
My home is I call it a play atelier. It's kind of like a maker lab for playing. And so I look at reading and I guess working. We don't want to hear this, but I look at playing and working as one and the same. And so I'm reading all kinds of things from like Rumi's tarot cards, which I think are a wonderful example, because this idea of ritual, again, you know, pulling a card, but then the card itself not really having any meaning except for what you prescribe to it, is an ongoing ritualistic activity of emergence, right? To just going outside and paddleboarding a little bit. I'm in Vancouver, but you know, we're doing a Medium platform for Burning Man, and we're curating a whole bunch of user-led content. So I've just been totally in this play, learning, I guess also working, mentality of listening and hearing what's going on. And I think that the things that I would be reading, if I was reading like strategically so, would be things on network design. I think social physics and the network design stuff and designing for inefficiencies, and kind of the things that I really hope that we can get into as a result of this conversation, where we start to think about how to put the emergent structures in place, is a place where I'm having a lot of fun revisiting.
Got it. And so social physics, Sandy Pentland from MIT doing some really interesting work there. A few weeks ago, we had Ting Jiang from Dan Ariely's Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is sort of about behavioral economics. You just reminded me, and I actually liked your tarot cards idea, because I think this notion of Rumi tarot cards, I don't know them, but I don't know how many people have ever seen this. It's Oblique Strategies, and it's from Brian Eno. And actually, he kept this pile of cards. He started with basically a list, but he was working with David Byrne, and I don't know if you know much about Brian Eno, but he started keeping this list of like kind of oblique strategies, like which frame would make, which frame would make this right, and he would use these. He decided to turn them into cards, so they weren't. This is actually my whole mantra, I think. Try faking it, which actually kind of evolved into this way of kind of randomly pulling things. And he would pull these. He's a famous music producer and musician, and he would pull these out. This is from like probably the 70s or the 80s, and then it was reissued. But it's one of my favorite kind of weird things to pull from. Irwin, did you have something that maybe you would recommend for us?
I mean, I'm in New York City, so this epicenter craziness, so I try to go for a walk with my wife every single day. We try to walk at least 50, I guess more than that. We walk from 70, almost 100 blocks. And we walk the same exact walk every day now, because it's a safe walk where there are not a lot of people, and we figured out when people come, where we can walk on the side, because we're trying to be really, really, really careful. And what's been remarkable is I've lived in this city for my whole life, essentially, and as my wife, and we walk together and we pick out and notice things we have never noticed in our own city, statues that we never noticed, cornices that we never noticed, buildings and way they circle, in a sense, they do a little circle around the block in Riverside Drive. The change in the trees just in the 7-8 days that we have been walking that every day. I think there's a noticing that, at least living in an urban environment like New York City, rushing all the time, going into the subways, doesn't happen. And we're really trying to do that every single day. And it's remarkable. I never saw that. How can we never see it? And of course, that's a metaphor for, there's a lot of stuff. This virus better be a burning light of helping us see stuff. And if it does, and I think that's, what everybody's been saying, if this really can help us see more clearly, when the scales come off the eyes, if I can use another religion's metaphor, when the scales descend and the eyes open, you see reality more. And if that doesn't open up your heart and create a different sense of purpose to use all of our abilities, all our capacities, all our power, all our technology to wander, I've been saying that I don't believe there's amazing grace. I'm sort of post-religion that way, but I do believe there's a maze of grace, and we can help each other wander through the maze of grace.
Irwin, if it's an early indicator, the conversation going on in the comments in this show people are completely excited, jumping in with what they're learning and appreciating this conversation among all of you. Nicole Bradford points out that she has been also learning gardening and creating food at home. And Mia Shaw actually was echoing the book that I wanted to bring up. The book that I went looking for on my bookshelf the other day was the book about the Sabbath by Wayne Mueller, because I was at home and you would think it would be calm. And I suddenly realized there was more incoming that I couldn't deal with. Like, I understood, like in the real world, when you drive to work or you go to the gym, or you go to dinner, these are natural breaks. If you're sitting here, a brain in the box, and everybody has a webinar and a thing coming in, and then you're sitting here with a partner and she's like on her screen, we suddenly realized we're completely, like, we had to invent a ritual to be together, which, okay, we weren't too good at. So then we started reading up on it. So I think that's one of the reasons we gave you a call.
And what's the name of that book, Peter?
Well, the one that I think I have, it's called The Sabbath by I think it's Wayne Mueller. What's your Irwin? You probably know the Sabbath books better than I do.
Yeah, that's great book.
Yeah. The other thing I was looking at is okay. As you pointed out, when you invent something new, someone ancient probably came off with it before, and the religion traditions. This is true in the media. Like, we think, all this connective stuff. But there was such a burst of energy in the 1960s with what's called expanded cinema, when people were looking at all sorts of deeply immersive stuff. And, we've talked about what Warhol did in this. Our show last week, we talked about Gene Youngblood in Expansive Cinema. So I've been rereading that. And at Gray Area, we've been doing a course on that.
That's a 1970s book.
He wrote it in 1970, based on work that went on in 1966. And
so it was like Andy Warhol on the East Coast, but it was also Grateful Dead on the West Coast, and sort of how they actually were at odds when they came together and actually tried to do a performance at the Fillmore. It was fascinating, kind of weird explosion from the psychedelic, drugged out kind of. It was groovy,
also a moment when
kind of thing.
It was a democratization moment in media. There was a whole independent underground film movement, so it was inexpensive to make stuff. There was social unrest and change. Now, the East Coast unrest was more amphetamine rattled. The West Coast stuff was a little bit more based on pot. So they were different cultures.
Psychedelic and mushrooms, yeah.
But it was... And they were also struggling with the physical and the virtual. I mean, Warhol would do these deeply immersive experiences that you went into, but then we also retreated into our mind because we were taking these inner trips of tuning in, turning on, dropping on, and we were also putting headphones on. And we're at that moment now. At Gray Area, we just finished a big immersive experience. We were doing place-based immersive media, but now you can't do place-based. So now suddenly we're jerking back to the virtual, right? So that it was just fun reading what we were doing 60 years ago. We may want to actually wrap up soon because it's Friday night. I felt really bad, Irwin, calling up a rabbi and say, how about you come on a show on Friday night? Because that's the one time we know you probably have an appointment. So we really want to thank you.
Yeah,
it's all right.
Thank you so much, Irwin.
This is a perfect entry to the Sabbath for me.
Thank you, Tim and Jen. I mean, this has just been personally very good for me.
Tim, I wanted to end up on one thing. When we talked the other day, you had 3 emerging theses that literally you and your kind of friends in the VC world are coming up with, and I'd love you to just punctuate them. You mentioned there's this thing about resilience, which is really a lot to do with homes and design. You touched on this whole new communications thing, and you had one on work. So can you give us a preview into kind of when the smoke clears, but not back to normal, what we can expect in innovation?
Sure. 3 or 4 points real quick. We're seeing the rise of resilience tech, and this involves things like how to have resilient, healthy homes and lifestyle. I think this is an evolution of what we used to call smart home. Imagine someday if pandemics and climate collapse effects become topical and continuous, this could affect even interior design. Imagine most buildings have an airlock, which is a place that you take off your external gear and you have to sanitize or whatnot, or do the tests on your blood or something in real time. That's how extreme it could be. This ties into the notion that all we've been doing for space tech to figure out how to colonize uninhabitable worlds. What if we have to use space tech to deal with surviving in our home world as it becomes more uninhabitable? You might see some of those applications. And this ties into things like what I kind of think of it as disaster or climate collapse adaptation. Because I do think many of those effects will be kicking in. Wildfires in Marin are common. We're going to see some of those things. So that's the resilience tech that moves more towards decentralized local innovation and just more, again, resiliency at the individual, the household, the community level, instead of over-reliance on centralized systems. Second is we're seeing more innovation of tech and services for community and connection. This is all of the, the Zoom room experiences happening. That's going to birth new platforms, new experiences, new systems. This will be about wellness and support for each of us at the me level, the we level, and then the all level. We're going to see a rise in things that are driving end-of-life tech, as well as what I call legacy tech. And this is for, how do we process things like grief, and how do we memorialize people virtually? Because that's going to be something we have to process in mass as society. We don't have those tools right now. Something I'd like to see born from Virtual Burning Man this year is a virtual version of the temple that everyone on the planet can leave a memorial for someone dear to them. That maybe it's persistent, maybe it burns every day, maybe it burns every week, but this could be the birth of a global legacy vault, right? And then we're going to lastly see the redefinition of what digital work is. It's going to be done remotely. But what if this could be a great equalizer? What if this could start the diaspora away from all the talent just working in San Francisco or New York? Because once we reinvent a lot of these jobs over Zoom and whatnot, then Perhaps that's a reason to go live in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, instead of living in San Francisco. Some of these jobs won't ever want to come back to the office, and that could be a good thing. I know that's for the privileged white-collar knowledge workers. We need to figure out solutions for, the hourly workers, the gig workers, and everything else, especially at the blue-collar level. But it will be an entire reinvention of every type of job.
Well, by the way, as an affirmation of that, don't forget, this is a show brought to you by Maker City, which is the book that Dale Doherty and Marcia Kadnoff and I wrote. And the whole premise of that, that actually, and the whole maker movement came out of the fact that we all thought we were a little bit over-indexing for knowledge workers and text and whatever Richard Florida wrote about, and that this probably had to happen more in the middle of the country. So in fact, both affordability and the fact that we've learned to work remotely, one thing America has a lot of is great downtowns and cities. So that's a very hopeful point. Jen, all of this tees up that we're heading towards a world of emergence, and many of the principles that you're working on where emergence and play may be the strategic principles for our cities and boardrooms.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to going deeper on how we look at, what some of the residual side effects of what we're going through are, and also how some of the more strategic ways of working with them to encourage more of that emergence might look like. So we're in a good spot to keep going on this, I think.
And Irwin, I think you had a comment you wanted to bring in.
Yeah, I want to kind of end where we started with Mickey, and that there's a teaching from the early 19th century, a mystic sage who said, there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. And it seems to me that one of the things that in the personal loss of a father, especially one who is playful, especially one who clearly you loved, especially one that was respected and who brought light, to be able to feel the brokenheartedness is really key to feel the wholeness. And I think that's also true with this virus. If we don't feel the brokenheartedness that this virus is creating, if we don't feel that, the wholeness that can potentially emerge, the new holistic ways of thinking that we're talking about and doing and making and being and creating, it'll be very hard for that to birth. So maybe Mickey was in a sense, it's real life and it's metaphor, Mickey, that our fathers, something is dying right now. And it's a lot of things that we've inherited, but a lot of it was filled with light, and a lot of it was playful, and a lot of it created the world that we now have inherited. And now it's okay. There's a brokenness. We have to lean into the brokenness so that we can feel the wholeness that we ourselves will create in light of putting all that brokenness together in new ways.
Nick?
I just want to echo the sentiment of experiencing also, and just really experiencing everything around us too, like gardening and discovering new things in your cities. But the idea of breaking bread together and supporting those in need, I think, is how we actually create the new businesses and civic mindset that will get us out of this. Nick?
I'm out.
Okay, I want to. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you. The great irony here, or the thing that amazes me, is when we started in on this, we thought this was going to be a sad show about grief. And we knew we were going to head into it, and we wanted to examine it. And as Mick pointed out, we were a little conflicted about doing something that would be, I don't know, down or sad. But how amazing that in this conversation about loss and ritual, we may have had the most electric conversation yet we've had on this topic, because we realized this is really about innovation and rebirth. And when, I don't know, the most fun thing about this is we start planning it and we talk to people who are going to be on, we suddenly realize there's some grand theme that connects it up. And I would not have guessed that the theme that connected this whole thing up was just innovation. This mother of the necessity is just creating innovation around ritual, around how we connect with each other, that perhaps this is both where investment dollars go next and our attention goes next. So I want to thank everybody, for this path. And by the way, the very fact that we're all stuck at home and the only way we could reach out was through these electro gizmos we're on now is what Irwin let me reconnect with you, that you and Mickey made this connection. Tim, You and I have been connected in joyful moments like this and in a couple of funerals. Jen, you and I have had these conversations for years, but what a great coming together. And out there, you know, connected with us are a lot of our friends in the burner community. Nicole Bradford's out there. And so I want to thank everybody, including Mohib, who has been helping us with a lot of the technical design here, Mia and Anna, who are our producers, and Omid, who is our executive producer and has been switching this show from Southern California or wherever he is today. Thank you so much for joining us this Friday on QuaranTIME. We'll be back next Wednesday and next Friday. And boy, thanks everybody. What a send off to the Sabbath. Have a great weekend.
Let's get close, but not so close. QuaranTIME. You can share from a distance. QuaranTIME. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your QuaranTIME space while we talk. QuaranTIME.